When I heard that Teyon, the developers who made the Rambo game, were working on a first-person shooter set in the Terminator universe, well, I didn't really have high hopes. They'd kind of ruined one film series with their last effort, and I expected them to do the same thing yet again with Terminator Resistance. Probably the biggest shock though, and one of the biggest surprises I've had in gaming all year, is that not only is Terminator Resistance not a terrible game, but it's actually kinda good.
Take cover! No!
I know, we've got a half-decent Terminator game and it's a first-person shooter. I don't even know what timeline this is anymore. Now look, Terminator Resistance isn't any kind of masterpiece, but I was genuinely stunned at just how fun this game actually is. And if you're a fan of the series, I think it makes up for a lot of its shortcomings with some much wanted fan service, and the fact that it's been made by people who clearly love the source material.
Ariel is going down!
You'd hardly know this thing was even out though, because it seems they've spent absolute jack on their advertising. But yes, Terminator Resistance has just been released for the PlayStation 4, Xbox One, and Microsoft Windows. One of the best things about loading this game up for the first time was hearing that rendition of the film's theme during the main menu, which might honestly be one of the best versions, like, ever. But anyway, what is Terminator Resistance? Well, I'm so glad you asked.
That's one ugly son of a bitch.
If I had to sum the whole thing up, it's kind of like a semi-open world shooter where you're playing as a member of the Resistance fighting back against Skynet in the not too distant future. In case you're unaware of the story, Skynet was a military computer system that went self-aware, and in their attempt to wipe out the majority of the human race, they orchestrated a nuclear holocaust. And anyone who wasn't wearing 2 million sunblock had a real bad day. They now maintain order with droves of robots and cyborgs that patrol the surface, either capturing or killing human survivors. The battleground is Los Angeles, and the Resistance isn't doing too great, barely scraping by and trying to avoid being wiped out by the looming threat of an artificial intelligence that really doesn't like us. The game takes place before the events of the first two films, when Skynet is still at a point where they're developing the Terminator infiltrator units, along with the time displacement equipment they used to send back the T-800s in the films. You're playing as a guy named Jacob Rivers, who's separated from his squad at the beginning of the game and has to flee to avoid being killed. He soon meets up with a small group of survivors who are trying to repair a bus and leave the city. One of the first things you do in the game is to help these guys get this thing back on the road, and what's actually interesting about this is that you can choose different dialogue options when talking to all of these characters throughout the game.
Do you remember Judgment Day?
I do.
Being more apathetic to someone's plight earns you positive points, kind of like the system used in the Fallout games, where the way you treat people can affect their opinion of you in a positive or a negative way. Side characters have their own quests, which raises their trust towards the player, and that's something that plays a big part in the game's endings.
What about your father? What happened to him?
Now, without spoiling anything, the events of the game pretty much lead up to the events in the first film, when you play a direct role in what happens. Without spoiling too much, let's just say that you can expect to see a fair bit of John Connor. You also play a pretty direct role in getting laid. Yeah, you can have sex with 2 of the female characters in this game. I've got to give Teyon props for this alone. Heterosexual sex scenes in a 2019 video game? The absolute madmen.
I know, I'm flattered.
Anyway, the way the campaign works is that you chat to NPCs in between main missions. A few of them will often give you a side mission that always takes place in the same area as the main mission. And you can either just go right ahead and stick to the campaign, or go off and explore these environments and complete all of this side content for extra experience points, as well as improve your standing with all of these NPCs. A recent example of similar design is something like Metro Exodus, and you can do as much exploring as you want to, or just beeline towards the next part of the story. In these large areas, aside from your mission objectives, you'll also find Skynet outposts throughout each location, which can be snuck into and destroyed.
Plasma storage destroyed.
Good to hear, Rivers. Now proceed with your mission.
You'll also find safe houses, which is the only way to save your game outside of sporadic checkpoints. Or you can just loot everything you find, collect resources which are used as currency to buy items, or collect crafting components to make into pipe bombs, medkits, or devices that make noise to attract enemies. Some of these items are a bit superfluous though, like a stim that gives you slow motion for a short period of time. I mean, it's cool, but hardly essential. Aside from that, the gameplay is broken up into stealth and combat. Now I say and instead of or because you really need to utilize a combination of both. When you're in an enemy's line of sight, after a short while, a meter is going to fill up, then they're eventually going to spot you, and everything in the nearby vicinity is going to start to come after you. Stealth isn't mandatory, but it is useful to initiate combat when it's more convenient for the player. For instance, you can hack into turrets and let them do the work for you. And there's even a one-off item called a Terminator knife that you can use on the T-800s that takes them out in a single hit, which kind of functions like a melee takedown. You've also got fancy night vision goggles that can see enemies through walls, which helps you stay out of sight for as long as you want. But when you do want to go in guns blazing, that's an option too, and there's a lot of guns to play around with here, from something as basic as a pistol up to the plasma-based weapons. Weapons fall into primarily two categories. You've got your small arms like your pistol, shotgun, and assault rifle, and then the plasma-based guns, a lot of which are from the films and the only weapons capable of damaging the T-800s. There's some scripted sequences where you pretty much have to engage in combat, so at one point or another, you're gonna have to be shooting these things.
I don't like this! I don't like any of this!
Outside of that, Resistance uses a skill point system that's about as generic as they come. You earn XP from killing things or completing missions, and then you spend your skill points each time you level up. You upgrade your health points, you upgrade the weapon damage you do, you make it so you can lockpick higher strength locks or hack into more sophisticated computer systems. There's about a dozen or so of these all up, and you'll pretty much unlock all of these by the end of the game. And yes, you'll have seen all of this stuff before. The lockpicking mechanic is right out of Fallout, for instance, even down to being able to force a lock with a percentage chance for success. And the hacking minigame is pretty much Frogger. But here's the thing, yes, this has all been done before, but it's never been done in a Terminator game, and definitely never so competently in a Terminator game either. If this was just a standard sci-fi game and you were taking on generic robots, this would probably be about as much fun as trying to piss down a urinal cake. But that Terminator license can really propel something to another level. We're talking about one of the coolest sci-fi franchises of all time, if not the coolest. Ignoring how they've ruined it with the recent films, those first couple of movies are some of the best action flicks ever made. A movie license can carry a lot of weight and elevate something to a higher standard. Part of what helps here and what makes Terminator Resistance so good is that it's just packed with fan service, especially if you're a fan of the first two films, which you bloody well should be. For starters, the infiltrator unit that's hunting you wears the same outfit that Arnie wears in the first film, for no reason, just because it's blatant fan service. One of the first guns you get is an Uzi 9mm. I don't think I even need to explain that one. You can rescue a stray dog during a side mission and call it either Max or Wolfie. Wolfie's fine, dear, Wolfie's just fine. And again, this has no bearing on the story, it's just thrown in there.
How about Max?
The Resistance base you spend a lot of your time is pretty much the exact same one as the one that Kyle is seen in during the first film, even down to the guard dogs at the entrance and a TV set being used as a makeshift fireplace. When you're out and about at night time, hunter-killers patrol, shining a spotlight across the ground as they fly past. I mean, it's fucking awesome. My only complaint is that there's no Techmar Club. Sound design is faithful to the films as well. You'll hear that very awesome sound effect for the plasma rifles countless times throughout the campaign, and it never gets old. You'll be using both the M27 phased plasma rifle in a 40-watt range, of course, along with the plasma minigun we saw that infiltrator using in Terminator 1. And the music, my god, son, the music. I don't know if they've actually taken tracks from the films, but it sounds so similar to the stuff that Brad Fiedel created. This game's rendition of the theme music, like I said before, is easily the best version of the theme tune we've pretty much ever had. And even the original tracks in here sound pretty good. The whole thing just feels so fan-made, and I mean that in the best way possible. The game's almost more of a love letter to the films than it is its own standalone video game, but I've got no problem with that. What I really liked about Resistance 2 is that early on in the game, the T-800s are treated as an actual threat. You can gun down the other robots pretty easy, but the T-800s are a different breed, and your standard guns won't do jack shit. At the time you encounter them, you're only going to have an assault rifle, shotgun, and the Uzi, so what you have to do instead is just outright avoid them. There's a really cool section where you're inside a hospital, sneaking through the corridors trying to avoid them, and it is amazingly tense. After that, you've got to escape the area, but now it's swarming with like a dozen or so of these things. These sections were actually nerve-wracking because if you're spotted, they can gun you down in seconds, as it should be. Once you get your hands on some of the plasma weapons, you can actually dish out damage, but even then, they can still be super spongy. And if you're not aiming for their head, they can finish you off super quickly. It's actually a really good combination of making them feel strong but not too tough that it just becomes repetitive and dull trying to wane down their health bar. Of course, that all goes out the window though once you start upgrading the plasma weapons. Yeah, you see, the plasma guns in this game can all be upgraded using Skynet chips that you loot from enemies. These include things like increased fire rate, weapon stability, but more importantly, weapon damage. And they drop so often that it almost starts to lose value. You can equip 3 of these on one weapon. The only catch is that you've got to match up the circuits properly or else they won't link up. But if you stack up even 2 damage chips for instance, using a weapon like the plasma rifle becomes laughably overpowered, and you can mow through pretty much everything without all that much of a fuss. That's only for the first generation plasma rifles too. They include Skynet's second generation plasma rifles as well, and those things are even more overpowered. But still, they really nailed the way these weapons sound and feel, and there's a sense of authenticity here that's just never really been seen in a Terminator game. I think the last game to get it this right was Terminator Skynet back in 1996. Yeah. Shit. Okay, now onto the bad stuff. Now, this is a game that looks faithful to the source material, and it does a good job at that most of the time. They really captured that feeling of moving through those ruined city streets and buildings. The way the moonlight pierces through the smoke in the night sky looks genuinely gorgeous at times, and it makes a nice contrast between fire being used as a light source on the ground. The modelling for the enemies, especially the T-800s, is highly detailed. The T-800s in particular look great. There's a boss fight against an infiltrator unit, and you can even shoot and burn the flesh off his endoskeleton. It's amazing. It runs on the Unreal 4 engine, so no big surprise, but still, there's some areas in the game that really do look last gen. It's like something you'd see on an early PS3 game. One of the outside areas set during the daytime just looks bad. The consolation here is that the lighting generally does look really good, and the engine takes full advantage of those capabilities. There's a whole heap of visual options to play around with, but like all Unreal 4 engine games, the whole image looks super blurry, and there doesn't seem to be a way to turn this crap off. And I really don't like how I can't even change my FOV either. Thankfully, the game seems to run pretty smoothly, and I never had any serious issues, so that's a plus. It's just a shame the visuals couldn't be held to a high standard throughout the entire game. The controls could maybe also be a little bit smoother. Sprinting feels really delayed at times, and there's no way to mount or grapple up ledges, which seems like an odd omission. Though you do at least get infinite sprinting, so that's nice. Really, my major complaint with the game though is that it's just too easy. I played the game on hard mode, and even then it was barely a challenge. I was just always flushed with ammo, healing items and lockpicks, and at one point I think I had like 30 or so medkits. You get this plasma sniper rifle about halfway through the game, and a single headshot to a T-800 is going to knock it on its ass, almost killing it. A second shot's going to finish the job. Once you've maxed out your weapon skill, this goes down to a single headshot, and it just makes the Terminators trivial. It just becomes far too easy to dispatch these things from a longer range before they can even see you or fight back. The T-800s aren't exactly Mensa level intelligent. About the best they can do is just walk slowly in your direction when you're detected, or investigate the area if you're making too much noise. That is kind of the point of them though, I guess. I mean, they're just mass-produced killing machines. They just hulk around and murder whatever gets in their field of view. They don't use guerrilla tactics or lie in hiding to ambush resistance members. They're kind of like a blunt object used as shock troops and relying on their high numbers and dexterity, instead of their supreme intellect. They walk up to you and they shoot you, that's about it. My point is that outside of a few boss fights where actual tactics are required, don't expect any kind of earth-shattering artificial intelligence from any of the enemies in this game. Ironic too, considering you're fighting the AI system that literally almost wiped out mankind. To be honest, saying that a game is too easy isn't a horrible problem to have. You can always turn up the difficulty setting anyway, which is something I would suggest that most people do, because normal difficulty mode is just a joke. And if you actually play this thing on easy, well, then you're dead to me.
God damn it!
I guess too, if you're not a fan of the first couple of films because you're some kind of jaded asshole that hates fun, well, then this isn't really going to tickle your ballsack. The gameplay loop can be repetitive at times, just going around opening cupboards and looking through condemned buildings for loot, but it's not really a mandatory mechanic. You can get by just fine buying all of your weapons instead of trying to make them yourself. I had no problems with going around and exploring every nook and cranny. I mean, yes, sometimes it was repetitive, but I was often rewarded with new weapons or extra skill points, so I'd hardly consider it a waste of time. Overall, the whole thing took me about 8 hours to get through, and that was with finishing all of the side missions, maxing out my character, and trying to get as much of the gear as I could. In Australia, they're charging $55 reduce for this, which is a little bit over half the price to what we normally pay. Considering the dev's history and all that kind of stuff, this whole game is a revelation. And if they continue on this trajectory, their next game's gonna be a goddamn masterpiece. To sum the whole thing up, Terminator Resistance is a shooter set in the Terminator universe that is packed with fan service and manages to recycle a bunch of other mechanics from other shooters and throw them all together into one competent, serviceable package. It is a bit rough around the edges and it doesn't try to reinvent the wheel, it just does what it does well and with minimal fuss. The story is interesting, the characters are likeable, you get laid not once but twice, and it has a decent enough length given its price. That rhymes.
Good idea!
And if you're a fan of the first two Terminator films, well, I think you owe it to yourself to check this one out. Those people, however, who aren't staunch fans might want to give this one a miss.